So today we're going to talk about this time period called Reconstruction. So this time period is after the Civil War. And so if you remember from last class, the Civil War was a war that was inside America when the southern states tried to leave the United States and make their own country in order to protect slavery. And then the North comes in to try to keep the country together and then ultimately tries to end slavery at the end of the Civil War. So, what is a symbol or a monument? So, a symbol or a monument might be something like the Washington Monument that you use to honor or remember somebody who is important to history, or it might be a statue that's supposed to represent this ideal that your country has. For example, the Statue of Liberty. And so, what is the purpose of these symbols and monuments? So, the purpose of these monuments, they could possibly be to try to remember your heritage. And so I think now, especially with what's happening with Black Lives Matter and with the discussion of removing more Confederate statues or legacies of slavery, it's important to think about, and as we studied the Civil War last class, the Confederate flag is part of Southern history and heritage. Does our country want to remember that? Or do you think this? All Confederate symbols and monuments should be taken down. So, do you think our country should uphold and honor these legacies of the Civil War, of the Confederacy that really left the country in order to preserve slavery? Or should they all be taken down? And so, a lot of times people are going to say that these Confederate symbols and monuments, what they represent racism and they represent oppression. They represent a country that tried to separate from our own country in order to preserve the institution of slavery. And so for many people, they want these symbols taken down because they say there is not a place in the United States to honor these ideas of racism and slavery. And so just some quick facts about Confederate monuments. So most of these monuments, actually, they're going to go up after the Civil War. They're going to go up in between the years of the 1920s and really the 1950s. So they don't go up during the Civil War itself. And there's a total of about 1,500 Confederate names and symbols throughout the country. There's public schools that are named after Confederate leaders. There's counties and cities named for leaders of the Confederacy, military bases named for the Confederacy. And keep in mind, the Confederate States of America, they were a group of people that tried to separate from the entire United States. So they were actually at war. They were enemies with the United States that exists today. And so this is an issue of conflict in our country, and it still is today. And so to many white Southerners, the flag, it's an emblem, they say, of regional heritage and pride. But I think over time, more and more and more, it becomes evident that it really is a symbol of racism and slavery, and a symbol that reminds us of the South's desire to maintain the supremacy for white Americans. And so even in the Declaration of Independence for the Confederate States of America, they specifically say our position is thoroughly defined with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. So there is no separation between the Confederate States and slavery. So why is this still an issue today? I don't know. That's something to think about, and possibly it could be because of the way we tell the story of the history of the Civil War, and maybe the way we choose to represent our country in history. So I think that's something that we're going to continue to visit throughout this year. And so today we're going to look at Reconstruction. What were the effects of the failure of Reconstruction after the Civil War? So how was the Civil War a failure? So again, the Civil War is between the North and the South. The North wants to keep the country together. The South wants to leave so that they can keep their slaves. What happens is the North wins, right? And so what does the United States usually do right after a war ends? Do we leave right away? Not really. Do we stay and rebuild? Yeah, probably. And do we move on to another one? Yeah, usually. So that's exactly what happens in Reconstruction. So, right after the Civil War, what the North does is they come in and they stay. They move into the South, and they have about 12 years where the Northern military is keeping and protecting African Americans with this institution called the Freedmen's Bureau. And so, what they are going to do, they're going to protect the voting rights of African Americans. They're going to protect their legal rights, and they're going to keep off the white supremacists who live in the South. And so, in order to do this, the Freedmen's Bureau is going to try to uphold these three important amendments that are ratified after the Civil War. The first one is the 13th Amendment. And so this amendment frees slaves. It says that no one should be forced to work without pay unless they have been duly convicted. And so there is a little loophole there. If you are convicted, if you are a criminal, you may be forced back into slavery. And so if you've watched the documentary 13th, it is directly related to that clause and that loophole in the 13th Amendment. The Second Amendment, and if you ask me, this amendment is one of the most important amendments that we have in our Constitution. It says the 14th Amendment shall promise that everyone is treated equally under the law. So laws applies to everyone equally. And it also guarantees people who are citizens all their rights. And so this is going to be used to further equality in our country for people of color, for women, for people of different sexualities and different genders. And so the 14th Amendment to me is the equality amendment. The 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment is the amendment that promises that African American men and men of any race are guaranteed the right to vote. And it's going to stop states from making laws that might prevent them from voting. And so after 1877, what happens is really the North gets preoccupied with other politics. They're worried about big business. They're worried about railroads. And they get tired of paying all this attention to helping African Americans in the South. And so what that means is that there are going to be a series of laws called Jim Crow laws that are passed in the southern states that are going to get around these Reconstruction amendments. And so again, the Reconstruction amendments are the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. So the first of the Jim Crow laws is going to be this idea of this grandfather clause. And so basically the grandfather clause is going to be a statement that says you're not allowed to vote unless your grandfather voted. And so if your grandfather voted, you get a free pass. You get to vote no matter what. If you're a new voter, you might have to go through some steps. So you might have to pay a poll tax. Okay, so you have to pay to vote if your grandfather didn't vote. And so you also might have to take a literacy test if your grandfather didn't vote. And so whose grandfathers voted? Oh, it's the white people's grandfathers who voted. If you were black, your grandfather probably was a slave. So did you get to vote? No. So if you're black, that means you have to pay a poll tax. And so African Americans had to pay to vote. And oftentimes they were underpaid and poorly paid and lived in poverty. So could they afford to pay this special tax in order to vote? No. The way white people got around it was their grandfathers could vote, so they didn't have to pay the poll tax. Next is the literacy test. So again, if your grandfather voted, probably if your grandfather was white, you didn't have to take this literacy test. But if your grandfather didn't vote, and so if your grandfather was black, he didn't vote. And so now you have to go in and you have to take this super complicated literacy test, which probably no one could pass. Other ways that whites in the South kept blacks from voting is by instituting this thing called a white primary. And so a primary is where a political party basically chooses their candidates. And so a way they did that is they prevented the blacks from participating in that part of the political process. Other ways that they prevented blacks from participating in the political process is through sheer fear and violence and terror with organizations like the KKK. And so other ways that African Americans were not promised all of their rights. So African Americans could not own property or guns. And guess what? In order to participate in a lot of local elections, it's a lot easier if you own property or if you have a permanent place of residence. You're not allowed to own guns. You don't have voting rights. And guess what? There's this thing that's called vagrancy. And so if you don't have a job, if you're found walking on the street idle, guess what? You could be arrested. They're saying, oh, you're a vagrant. And so they could arrest you. And guess what? Once you're arrested, you can be forced to work for no pay. And in other words, that means slavery. So if you're arrested, you can go back into slavery. And so those are things called black codes. Other ways that Southern states kind of reinstitute this idea of white supremacy is through segregation. So laws and agreements that say white people live here, black people live here. These are more Jim Crow laws. We only serve whites, no Spanish or Mexicans. So in Texas, it was common to also segregate Mexicans, blacks, and whites all together, forcing African Americans to sit on the back of the bus. An important Supreme Court case that allows this to continue all the way up until the 1950s. So that's really not that long ago, probably like your grandparents' age. So all the way into the 1950s, this is legal. And so this Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, is going to be the Supreme Court case that allows this unequal and unfair treatment of whites and blacks to continue. So Plessy versus Ferguson allows unequal treatment to continue, and it continues for the next 50 to 60 years of the United States history. And so into the 1920s, what happens is you have the largest KKK rally in history. They marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the Capitol, basically demonstrating that this is what America is. There's race riots in Chicago, whites against blacks. You have in the 1950s resistance to integrating schools once they try to dismantle that Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. 1990s, you have the Rodney King and the LA riots that explode. And then even recently, right, you have Black Lives Matter in really like 2014, and then also now in 2020. It's continuing. And so this fight for equal treatment and equal protection, in my opinion, this fight for the 14th Amendment to be lived up to continues to this day. And so here are just some tweets from Donald Trump from 2017 about the removal of statues. And so I think it's important whenever you think about what should our country be portraying, what kind of message should our statues portray to the world and to the people. What do we want our symbols, our legacies to be? Do we want them to be these Confederate statues, or do we want them to be something else? And so a further implication of all of these, you can see the gap between white wealth and the wealth of Latinos or Latinx and blacks from 83 all the way to the 2000s. And so history matters, and it continues to affect us to this day.